Hello friends, welcome to The Third Rail. I'm Sarah, here with Troy Henderson and Joe Collins. Welcome guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Now first up, Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Philip Lowe, I was about to say Rob Lowe, but I've got it right, it's Philip Lowe, has told workers that they shouldn't be so concerned about job security and they should be demanding higher wages. Troy, pretty interesting comments coming from the head of the Reserve Bank.
Very interesting comments, I'd say unprecedented comments coming from a technocratic figure who's really the head of monetary policy in Australia, and he's lamenting the lack of wages growth in Australia, which is at historic lows, and really demanding that workers go out there and get a larger share of the economic pie, which I think is certainly needed given the terrible wages growth we've had over the last couple of years particularly. But it's a difficult thing to just achieve. You can't just say workers automatically deserve a higher wages and that's going to translate into higher wages. And we face various issues with that, particularly, the contradiction in the government's policy. On the one hand, you have even Scott Morrison talking about wages stagnation, but at the same time, he supports the cuts to penalty rates and he supports the Union Royal Commission, which is really about attacking a particular union, the CFMEU in Victoria, which is a union that's been more effective in getting higher wages for its members.
And what do you think, Joe? You agree?
I think it's a complete fantasy to argue that workers can just go out there and demand higher wages. I mean, that's certainly what the economics textbooks tell us. But I think for the majority of workers, in order to demand higher wages, they have to deal with things such as precarity in the workplace. I don't think Lowe has ever worked for a casual labour hire agency, for example, whereby if you do demand better conditions or wages, you just don't get called in the next day. I think it is true for some of the workforce that they do have more bargaining power in this context, but for the majority of workers, and if we're actually going to see a kind of macroeconomic lift in wage levels, it's complete fantasy.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's the point that you raised, because as I understand it, you need an increase in wages to increase spending, which will then result in increased economic growth. Now, I'm not an economist and that's probably pretty basic, but I think that's the right principle. And you hear the government go on and on and on about how important economic growth is, and they've got to try and push economic growth above 3%, I think is the number that seems to be...
That's the magic number, yeah.
The magic number. And yet, as you say, their actions actually don't really sit very comfortably with that. So, I mean, one thing that I was thinking about just in the last few days was what happened with the penalty rates cut and Labor's attempt to try and stop that cut coming into place. I mean, they lost the vote in the House, even though George Christensen crossed the floor. I mean, it was only one vote different, I think. But to me, it seems really bizarre that, I mean, or maybe it's not bizarre, maybe the government has just got an ideological agenda that's pro-business and they really don't give a shit about wages and workers.
I think they're torn. They're torn between their natural sort of class instinct, which is to support businesses being able to cut wages in particular enterprises. There's a term in economics called the paradox of costs, which basically means that it can be totally rational for an individual firm to cut wages, right, and boost its own profits. But if every firm in the economy does the same thing, you just get a lowering of aggregate demand throughout the whole economy, which lowers employment and lowers profits overall. And that's really bad for the government's apparent fiscal agenda of getting the budget back into surplus in 4 years' time, because it really relies on this heroic assumption that wages growth will suddenly pick up in 2, 3, 4 years' time and automatically deliver a surplus to the federal budget.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. So it's problematic in that sense. But the idea that when you have a labour market which is heavily skewed towards services, so tertiary services in the contemporary context, vis-a-vis this sort of idealised notion of the labour market that we had in the 1970s. I mean, the notion that you can have wages growth in manufacturing as against services where most people are employed as baristas or people where you rely upon 3 or 4 different casual jobs to cobble together a living wage. The idea that you can all of a sudden unionise and say, hey, we can demand better wages, is ridiculous.
And presumably you need to unionise to make that demand, because notwithstanding what Philip Lowe says, that people shouldn't worry about job security and that they shouldn't be so scared about flexibility in work,
Yep.
you do need, I mean, the only way you can really get power is collectively.
That's certainly the lesson that history has taught us. If you want increase in wages across the board, then you need to have increased union membership.
And we don't have that, obviously. Union membership has declined.
We've seen a catastrophic fall in union membership from about 40% of workers in the early 1990s, around the time of the 1991 recession, to 15% today. And it's even worse when you look at young people, where I think the union density is about 6%. So that doesn't augur well for the future of the union movement. And I completely agree with Joe that, you know, it is empirically true that union members, unionised workers, get better outcomes in terms of pay and conditions. So it is very difficult, if you've had huge structural changes together with an ideological assault on unions for the last 30 or 40 years, to suddenly get higher wage outcomes.
Yeah. And there are two big questions for me. Can you actually have a return to those kinds of numbers in terms of union membership in the contemporary Australian economy? I think there are problems around that reality. The second question is, are we talking about partisan politics here? So whichever party's in power, they need to maintain that 3% magic number. So does that mean that, given the present reality of floating exchange rates, of liberalised trade and finance, can you actually institute the same kind of policy framework that you had toward the end of the 1960s, where you had historically high wage growth, within a different kind of international context? I mean, this notion that we can just romanticise the past and say, let's go back there and let's institute policies from the golden age of Whitlam or whatever, is ridiculous. So we have to ask different questions about what we can actually achieve in the contemporary period.
Well, I just think it's interesting that you've got, the head of the Reserve Bank, which obviously is a very powerful institution in the economic framework because it's responsible for monetary policy, coming out and saying something that I would have thought would be pretty controversial from the perspective of the government of the day. It sort of makes me, for a layperson who isn't an economist, obviously, you sort of think, well, who are you to believe? I mean, on the one hand, you think, well, maybe I should believe him more than anyone else because he is the head economist effectively, and he's sort of running one aspect of government policy. And yet, I just find that it's so confusing for ordinary people to know which way to turn when they're making decisions about what is the appropriate, economic policy. For example, when they're coming to vote.
Yeah, well, I think partly he's exasperated because of the limitations of monetary policy. I mean, you can only lower the headline cash interest rate so much, and it's 1.5% at the moment. And the Reserve Bank is concerned about the housing bubble in Sydney and Melbourne and weak economic growth and wages growth throughout the rest of the economy. So it's really a plea from Philip Lowe for fiscal policy or just real wage increases from other sectors of society to offset the limitations of monetary policy.
And it's interesting because, of course, recently we saw the Fair Work Commission come out and deal with the minimum wage issue. And apparently, and that will correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that the government's position was that it urged the Commission to take a very cautious approach to increasing the minimum wage, because part of the reason apparently was that there are a lot of low-wage workers in apparently high-wage families, is what I had read. It was the part of the submission that I think was signed partly or perhaps wholly by Michaela Cash. Go figure. So it's just interesting that, you have a government which is, as we've said, so focused on trying to improve economic growth and improve its own economic management by being the managers that bring the economy back to surplus on the one hand, and on the other hand, doing the things that actually do not advance that proposition. And I find it, frankly, quite ridiculous, is all I can say.
Yeah, well, it's the same Malcolm Turnbull line, isn't it? If you're having trouble getting to the housing market, get your parents to write you a cheque for $200,000.
Exactly.
And that's great if you grew up in the Turnbull household.
Yep.
But I asked my parents and they told me to bugger off.
And I'm sure a lot of parents would say the same.
Can I just add one more thing that we haven't touched on, which is about public investment, right, which even very conservative bodies like the IMF, OECD are calling for increased public government investment in infrastructure because they recognise growth is so sluggish, wages growth is so sluggish. Turnbull did a bit of that in the last budget, 75 billion over 10 years, but still in a huge economy like Australia, with even the federal budget being $470 billion, it's not that much money. And I'd like to ask, the Labor Party is very critical, for example, of the Liberals blowing out public debt, which is true. Net public debt has doubled during the time that the coalition has been in office, which is funny, right? It's funny because they said they're the anti-debt and deficit people and they're going to rein it all in. Hasn't happened at all. But if the Labor Party wins the next election, they're probably not going to do anything about the public debt either. And I would argue that they shouldn't. That if you want to reduce public debt in the medium term, you should increase it in the short term to provide direct jobs to people now.
Well, absolutely. And this is what Lowe's statement is really about. The problem is not public debt, it's about private debt. That's why you need a wage increase, because you need to decrease private debt levels. Now, this idiotic idea that our public debt is somehow problematic has been proven wrong time and time again. So the article, the research that everybody cited in the wake of the GFC to justify austerity measures was this Reinhardt and Rogoff paper published in 2010 that said if you have a particular ratio between debt to GDP, it stifles economic growth. Now, a 28-year-old PhD student at UMass was asked as part of their course to reproduce a famous economic study in 2012. Now, Thomas Herndon, this student, reproduced the Reinhardt-Rogoff study and found that they'd missed 5 countries off the aggregation of their data. It effectively proved that this research was completely unfounded, and it had already been cited by various countries across the EU to justify austerity policies. So we know that there is no technical relationship between debt to GDP and economic growth. So why then are we talking about, and mind you, I might remind you that we have one of the lowest debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratios in the world, and we're still harping on about the need to get back to surplus.
I mean, I suppose the only advantage of the fact that our debt levels are so high under a Liberal government is that we won't be hearing too much about that come the next election, because there's just no way they can actually sell this idea that they'll be able to reduce the debt levels, I would have thought, because, and as you say, under their watch, the debt levels have increased dramatically. And I can't imagine Labor either going to the next election and saying, vote for us, we'll reduce the debt, because that's got to mean some austerity measures, and people vote for Labor for health spending and education spending.
Well, yeah, I mean, if it's got to mean austerity measures if you don't entertain certain possibilities or certain potential avenues of increasing revenue. And I mean, we closed one of those down in the mining tax debate, which I think is still something that deserves consideration. Poor old Brendan Grills in the WA election was taught the same lesson that Rudd was. But I think if we're talking about where we can increase revenue and stop worrying, I mean, this debate about spending, I think, is just minute compared to the actual question here. If we want to raise revenue, then we need to seriously start talking about LNG. We need to start talking about resources.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think we all agree on the panel, that's for sure, but I just want to encourage all of you workers out there to go and join your union, listen to the head of the Reserve Bank, and, fight together, band together to get better conditions for yourselves, because it's not going to happen in any other way.